issued some warnings that it probably isn't, or at least it may not be for much longer. And of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu himself one day says he's a believer in the two-state solution, and on another day he says not on his watch, or it's never going to happen, or the conditions he would put on it are such that no Palestinian interlocutor in the political negotiation could ever even begin to accept it. So there's a lot of skepticism both on the part of Americans, American political leaders, and Palestinian and Israeli leaders. Palestinian polls now, I would say for the last 10 years, for the first time have suggested that a broad swath of the Palestinian public does not believe a two-state solution is possible any longer. And so they are reflecting on other options for both the immediate and medium-term and the long-term future of their place in their homes. Here is one of the strongest arguments I can make, that this peace process that has been in effect really since 1991, led by American diplomacy, but with the assistance of the Quartet, which involves the UN and the Russians and European voices, the EU, and of course led by the United States, has been trying, hoping against hope, to somehow bring these two peoples who share this land, albeit in different circumstances, together to foster a two-state solution. That was the idea behind everything that's been called this peace process. This is only a partial list of all of the meetings and gatherings and arrangements or summits, or what other words I can use, powwows. I mean, you can make up your own words. I've run out of them. To attempt to find some kind of a formula that would enable these two peoples to live in the land west of the Jordan River in two states rather than one, in a way that they both could live with, even if in the process it would make many of them, or some of them, very unhappy to cede some of their rights and some of their territory, or however you might want to put it. Most recently were the proximity talks hosted by President Obama, pretty much after which he gave up trying to push this, since he found, this is a kind of a mantra that one hears, just insufficient partnership on the part of Israelis and Palestinians to make it happen. The Quartet, the European, American, and Russian group, their job has been supposedly to help mediate Middle East peace negotiations, to support Palestinian economic development in the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank, and to assist Palestinians in institution building to prepare the groundwork for when they might enjoy the fruits of freedom. But of course, all of that has been stillborn, some development, but really pretty ineffective in changing the political dynamic. It's a record of failure, frankly. There's really no other way to look at this. Lots of American diplomats from right, left, and center will still talk about why it's necessary, that there's no other reasonable plan given the current situation. But if the next president, or President Obama in his waning days, wants to insist on re-engaging Palestinians and Israelis in some kind of political discussion, one would look at this and think maybe he needs to find some other kind of a formula. And of course, that will be left for the next president. One can critique the United States' role in this. That's not my job today, but clearly something has not worked. Of course, the partners in the dispute, Israelis would blame the Palestinians would blame the Israelis, maybe sometime both of them might blame the Americans. There's plenty of blame to go around, but again, that's not what I'm here to talk about. What I want to talk about in making the case that a one-state solution, that a two-state solution is no longer feasible, possible, attainable, is by looking at the map. And Oslo II took the West Bank, and allowed for the fact that there are major Palestinian cities dotting the West Bank. They are in red. And Oslo II was an accord, short of statehood, but Palestinians presumed it was on the way to statehood. Israelis weren't so sure. That would give Palestinians, in effect, something approximating complete control over their lives in those red places that are marked. Al-Kilya, Tulkarm, in Ramallah, in Hebron, and so on. All of these main Palestinian cities that dot the West Bank. This is called Area A under Oslo II. I'll go back to the map in a minute, which supposedly gives full Palestinian Authority control over what happens in those cities. Area B, and that is only 2.7% of the entire West Bank. Area B makes up 25.5% of the West Bank. It involves shared Israeli and Palestinian Authority security control with Palestinian Authority civilian control, civilian jurisdiction. And then the largest area of the West Bank, 73% of it, remained under Israeli control. That's indicated in white. And green indicates the supposed joint control between Israel Defense Forces and Palestinian security forces, where they have been cooperating to maintain law and order in the West Bank, and from Israel's point of view, to assist Israel in its security mission, protecting its citizens, both in the West Bank, I'll talk more about them in a minute, and Israelis living west of the green line, which is this line here, demarcating Israel proper from the West Bank, which it came to control through the results of the 1967 war, something we can go into. Now, so here you have the division of the West Bank. This is still in effect, although very, very rickety in terms of the way it works, because at any time, the Israel Defense Forces can go into those cities and seek out and destroy Palestinians they've targeted. Here in this same security area where the Israeli military already controls the territory, that's obvious they can do that. So there are restrictions on Palestinian movement here and here, even though they have a semblance of control. In this part of the West Bank, Palestinians really can't go, can't traverse without a very elaborate system of checkpoints that exist here too to keep them from venturing into this area. We'll take a look at those. The final status issues for solving the conflict, but in conventional discourse to reach a two-state solution are these, where Israel and Palestine's borders would be, guaranteeing security for the people of Israel and the people of Palestine, Palestinian refugees who live in the millions outside of the borders between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. What are their rights? Many of them would either want to return either to Palestine in the West Bank and Gaza, or to former homes in what became Israel in 1948, or receive compensation for their experiences. That's a final status issue. Obviously, the status of the holy city of Jerusalem is important to everybody, including Christians living outside the Holy Land, and the status of Israel's settlements on the West Bank. We'll talk more about it in a minute. Now, in order to understand that mess, I want to come back to the reality that I began with when I really started talking seriously, which is today, two peoples, not one, live in the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. You can wish one of them away, you can wish both of them away. You can pick which one you want to wish away. But that is not going to happen. Thankfully, I would say. And incredibly, at this moment in time, they are of roughly equal population. The number of Jews living in the land between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea is approximately 6 million today, give or take. And the number of Palestinian Arabs, most of them Muslim, but a sizable minority Christian, today including Gaza, the West Bank, and within Israel proper as Israeli citizens, a subset of those. You add those all together and you get about 6 million Palestinian Arabs. So the populations are roughly even. And I've divided the Palestinian Arab community this way, making up the 6 million, more than 2.5 million in the West Bank, more than 1.75 million living as citizens of Israel, and more than 1.7 million living in the Gaza Strip. So you get these roughly equal populations. Of the 6 million Israeli Jews, between 500,000 and 600,000 live east of the Green Line that was Israel's internationally recognized border from 1948, early 1949, up until 1967. So something about 1 out of every 6 Israeli Jews lives beyond Israel's internationally recognized border, meaning they live somewhere on the West Bank. And so here's a map of some Jewish settlements. It's not a great map the way it's being projected, but there are these dots all over the place. Wherever you see, these are the zones that are part of Area B. So these are Palestinian territories. Jewish settlements primarily are in this area, in this large area, in this area, and then some more down here. They're also dotted over here, but maybe only 60,000 of the 500 to 600,000 live way out in this zone. So you have both the population of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs kind of spread out all over the place and mixed, even though they don't really want to live together. So let's now imagine, even if, suppose there were a second coming of Christ, or the Mahdi, or the Messiah, or someone showed up, certainly not a Cornell professor, and said, we woke up this morning and everybody agrees there should be 2 states. Right? Everyone now agrees. So let's see if we can make it happen. Even if we could agree on Jerusalem, on refugees, on security, 2 states for 2 peoples. How could it possibly work given the facts on the ground, what has happened since 1967? Here is the map today, which includes a wall that Israel began building in 2002, ostensibly to protect Israel within, on this side of the wall, wherever it is, from Palestinian suicide bombers, which were, suicide bombing was rampant during the 1990s and the 2000s. And a right-wing Israeli Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, who opposed creating any kind of a wall because it meant dividing the land. And the Israeli right has been very consistent, adamant, and frankly, quite honest about not wanting to divide the land, unlike some other Israeli political parties. So finally, because of the pressure that was occasioned by the campaign of suicide bombings in Israel's cafes and pizza parlors and the like in the 90s and the early 2000s, Israel began constructing this wall. But it didn't build the wall along the international boundary, the Green Line. It began to divert from it wherever there were significant settlement blocks. These are settlement blocks beyond the Green Line. And what's happened is, because so many Israeli Jews now live in these areas, wall or no wall, that the West Bank is divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, at least 4 zones, let's say. Some people would use the word Bantustans or cantons or whatever. Those are obviously loaded terms. I'm trying to avoid them, leaving that up to your judgment. But certainly zones or areas. And so the territorial contiguity of a Palestinian West Bank has really been very seriously broken up. This zone in particular, where Jerusalem is expanded way out to the east, almost goes to Jericho. It's virtually a 10-minute drive from here to Jericho. So the entire populated area of the West Bank, this part of the West Bank, is really completely underpopulated. But this is the heartland of the West Bank, and both the movement of Israelis into those areas and then the building of the wall breaks up the territory in such a way as to make territorial contiguity impossible. So let's just assume, as one of my opponents later on is going to argue, it's still possible. It's not possible. Because even if you could get agreement on everything, this is something that no Palestinian, under any circumstances, any, even if the matter, and for Palestinian Christians, Christ flying back to earth on a steamer, no Palestinian leader can ever agree in a negotiation to less than 22.5% of the land west of the Jordan River. Why? The state of Israel, within the Green Line, Israel's borders up until the 1967 war, make up 77.5% of the entire territory. That's Israel's internationally recognized border. So let's just say, okay, Palestinians agree, 22.5%. It's almost impossible to get to 22.5% given these zones, because most Israeli politicians will say they know that in any peace agreement, Israel will retain the settlement blocks. Well, where's the rest of the 22.5% going to come from? A little bit of it has been suggested coming from near Gaza, but at the moment Gaza is out of the picture because it's not even run by the Palestinian Authority. So there just isn't territory there to reach that 22.5%. And that's a fait accompli that's been accomplished by these settlements in those zones where you have these huge settlement blocks and approximately 500 to 600,000 Israelis living there. So land swaps cannot solve, in my opinion, the problem of territorial contiguity, without which you can't get to the 22.5% that I believe no Palestinian, under any circumstances ever, could agree to accept. Their compromise is accepting the existence of the State of Israel within 77.5% of what had been British-mandated Palestine. So let me wrap this up. These are impossible outcomes, the two-state solution as it's been conventionally defined. Notice that was an important word at the beginning of my title. I would hope that there is no military solution to this conflict. I will allow myself to say, God forbid. Neither people will go away, neither people can be militarily defeated, nor should they be. They both live in this land and have for a long time now. Israel, for its part, just as Palestinians will not, under any circumstances, agree, even if you solved everything else, to a state on less than 22.5% of the territory, no Israeli government, no conceivable Israeli government, would ever willingly agree to a single binational state in that territory. So if that were to happen, if that's someone's solution, you'd have to explain to me how you could convince Israelis to accept that and to live with it. So this leaves only unconventional and different and new ways to think about solutions to this conflict. That's not what I was asked to talk about here, but I have a feeling you might ask me about that in a few minutes, but I'm going to stop if that's okay. Is that long enough? Okay.
Now we'll take questions.
I would much rather have come, my students, there's a few students from the class here, I would much rather have come and had to make an argument about whether hummus or falafel is better to dine on. They can ask me to do that. Sure.
Do you think that if a right-wing leader, Ariel Sharon, is able to basically take every single Jew out of the Gaza Strip in 2005, do you think that any future leader would be able to take Jews out of the West Bank?
That's part of the problem. Thank you for completing the argument. Israel was traumatized when the Israel Defense Forces withdrew to the border of Gaza and 8,000 Israelis who were living in Gaza in settlements there were forcibly removed with tremendous anxiety, trauma, fighting back, and the like. You can imagine, well maybe you can't imagine, but I'll tell you what will happen if any Israeli government tried to remove 500 to 600,000 Jewish settlers from the West Bank. Not all of them, but the most religiously committed or nationalistically committed would regard this as an act of civil war. So I just can't see any way that that could happen. So I'm not talking about wishful thinking, I'm talking about realpolitik. It would plunge the state of Israel into civil war. Even if you took a proportion of those, say 100,000, and some Israeli government, even democratically voted that, yes, for the sake of some sort of agreement with the Palestinians, 100,000 have to leave the West Bank. Certainly the 60,000 in the Jordan Valley would have to, but some others too, let's say. That would still be more than enough to reduce the civil war in Israel.
Just as there are Arab citizens in the state of Israel, and given that it would be very unfair, like you said, to force the Jews that are living in the West Bank to leave their homes, do you think it might be possible to still have two states and have the Jews that are currently living in the West Bank actually become citizens of the Palestinian state?
So I didn't use the word unfair. That was a word that you supplied, which is a political statement. I may share it, I may not share it, but I didn't use the word unfair. What I'm saying is most of those people don't want to under any circumstances. They believe they've been sent there by God. They're realizing God's will. They're not, God is not the Israeli government the last time anyone checked, so they're not going anyplace. Would it be possible? It might have been 25 years ago, 30 years ago. It's no longer possible because there are too many and they don't want to live in a Palestinian state. They want to live in a Jewish state. I haven't spoken about the immense hatred that these two peoples have for one another, which cuts across all political lines and all political parties. They have learned to regard one another, generally speaking, and this, of course, ramps up during periods of violence, such as we're having now. Doesn't matter who perpetrates the violence. Violence is violence, the way they experience it. To imagine them sharing a polity at this point, that would truly be a second coming or something like that. I do not see this happening anytime soon in a kind of organic way. But you're onto something, and that is my non-conventional solution. I don't think it will happen. I think it's pie in the sky, but it's maybe the last way in which you could manage this without there being one state west of the Jordan River through some means somewhere down the road. Palestinians and Israelis might, at some future point, when they're tired of killing one another and want to grant one another equal rights and equal access to resources. Right now, one of them has a monopoly on that, so that would take some adjustment. But if we go back to the map, and this is, you're going to think I'm really crazy, but this is the only thing I can think of. That Palestinians and Israelis would live in one country, which they already do, that would have two federated autonomous entities, which could be called states, but they'd be something less than what a state is now, something a bit less than what the state of Israel is now, in which Israelis living here, where most Palestinians live, could be citizens of that autonomous zone. And Palestinians living here, if they wished, and there are almost 2 million of them now, could opt to be citizens of this autonomous zone or state. That one's political identity would no longer depend on territory, but would instead depend on an identity choice or a political choice. You couldn't force it on people. If Israelis wanted to be citizens of the Palestinian part of this land, they would have to have that right. Palestinians living here, there are many more of them, if they wanted to have that right, they would have to have that right. But the key thing would be every individual would have a free choice about where they would get their equal rights from. And the government would have to be federated. There would have to be a shared control over Jerusalem. You can just hear and just imagining how you get from here to there, that this might even be a more messianic kind of formula. But it's the only one I can think of that would acknowledge the existence of two peoples and then create something akin to what, at one time, both of them desperately wanted, which was two states for two peoples. I don't see any other kind of formula. This would be a very creative way of doing it. And it would require all kinds of things to happen before it could be realized. Yes?
Is there a possible example of that kind of unconventional system actually being successful? Because I think about, like Singapore and Malaysia, they tried doing that and it resulted in war.
Right. No, there is not. Not exactly like this, and not with 100 years of hatred and bloodshed. But what we're looking at, unfortunately, I wasn't here to talk about this, but what we're looking at, unfortunately, is more of the same. Since there's no political horizon at the moment, yes, there's an international agency, and the UN, and all of this, but this is not, at least in the short to medium run, going to change anything. It's not going to change the situation on the ground. So what you have is the status quo. So, but that's a whole other presentation and maybe debate. Yeah.
Compared to the two-state solution you just showed, how feasible do you think a three-state solution would be, with the West Bank going to Jordan and the Gaza Strip going to Egypt?
Oh, that's completely not feasible, because the reason that there's a dispute is that the Palestinian people are people like Israeli Jews are people. And they want to live in their homes. And they want to have the same rights that everyone else enjoys. They want to have the same rights that we enjoy here. They don't want to exercise those rights in Jordan or in Egypt. Egypt has never wanted to take responsibility for the Gaza Strip. It occupied it from 1948 to 67. Jordan occupied the West Bank and for a time did want responsibility for the West Bank and its Palestinians up until 67. But Jordan's occupation of the West Bank was never regarded as legal by any agency anywhere in the world except Jordan, because they swallowed up half of what was supposed to be Mary in Palestine, less than a quarter even. So that's a non-starter for my point. Let's get some other people. I think you already asked a question, right? Yes. You know, all the students in my class who are here tonight, you're getting extra credit. You are very brave. You've got to be out of your mind to want to listen to me twice in the same day.
Do you mean that?
Okay. You can hold me to it.
Okay. You said that Israel would not agree to a single binational state. Why the insistence on there being a Jewish state? Is there something about it? Is it an ethnic, a particular ethnic character?
It's a mix of historical, ethnic, political, and religious and cultural identity markers, which now, even if one would dispute there was a justification, as many Palestinians do, for the arrival of Jews into Palestine. There were always some Jews living among Arabs in Palestine, so that's not the problem. It's polity, it's authority, it's the exercise of control that became the problem over part of the territory, and now over the entire territory. But now there are 6 million Israelis there. It's their homes. They don't want to go someplace else. You can't undo history. So what you can do politically is you can find other formulas to satisfy the political values that we at least say we prefer to live by in the 21st century, which are, for Americans, one person, one vote. We do not believe that people anywhere in the world, we do this imperfectly ourselves. I always like to remind you, we have all kinds of obstacles that we're presently putting in the way of Americans to keep them from voting. So we do not do this well ourselves. And God knows, about violence being directed against certain communities from law enforcement officers here in the United States. So we do not do this very well at times. But we abide by the idea, at least, that all people have the right to self-determination. And certainly have the right to have the same rights as the people who live, 3 miles away from them. Not different rights, not less rights. So from an American point of view, I think this is maybe where some of the urgency came from. I expect this only to grow in the coming years, that sensibility from the United States. It already exists in Europe. I expect it to grow here. Yes?
Earlier when you were giving the very quantitative justification for why a two-state solution isn't feasible, considering the land percentages and whatnot, it seems as if basically the meshing and the intermingling of different ethnic groups in the West Bank is the major impediment. The fact that so
To the old conventional
Yes,
two-state
exactly.
solution.
And I'm wondering, so it seems as if I was not aware that the populations are now almost even.
Yes.
So I'm wondering where that population growth is coming from. I know that Israelis have far more mobility than Palestinians, but I'm wondering if American Jews and European Jews, but largely American Jews moving to Israel, is increasing the population and exacerbating the
Marginally at the moment.
Okay, so
Marginally.
where's the population?
Well, 1 million Jews from the former Soviet Union arrived in Israel in the 80s, 90s. And that was, at the time, about a quarter of Israel's Jewish population at the beginning of that trend. So that was a major demographic development. Another really important demographic development that's going to sustain this demography is that Palestinians have lots of children, because that's what they have always done. Because the very, very religious sector in Israel has certain, I have to watch how I'm going to say this, has certain beliefs and practices around childbirth. They are producing families 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And their proportion of Israel's Jewish population is growing. It's approximating 20% now. It's only going to continue to grow. So I don't see a terrific shift in the demography. Certainly nothing significant as the stark reality that you have two peoples there of roughly equivalent size. Yes?
Time for one more question.
Maybe just two really short ones.
Yeah.
It's my answers that are the
Yeah.
problem, not the questions.
I know it's hard to generalize, but how did the Arab citizens, or the Arab people, sit around 1.25 or 1.75 living in the Israeli territory? Do they feel happy?
Living within Israel.
Yes, living within West Living. Do they feel?
That's a really complex question. I think that's a really complex question. They identify as Palestinians. So when they think of themselves as Palestinians, they feel marginalized in the country of which they are citizens. They vote in Israeli elections, they have representatives in Israel's parliament, but they enjoy none of the natural privileges that Israel's Jewish population receives. Their per capita expenditure on public works projects on schools, and so on is far less than Israel's Jewish community. So legally they have every right that every Israeli Jew has, but the existence of the conflict on the one hand, and then they may be connected, the fact that they don't enjoy all of the same living standards that Israeli Jews do, they're very conscious of their difference. I'll just leave it at that. It's a really important and big topic. But there are a lot of those folks. Yes.
Yeah, so admittedly this is a topic I have a very shallow understanding of, but it's common, at least from my perspective, to hear the Israeli settlements in the West Bank characterized as being illegal. And so I was hoping you could just explain the perspectives on whether they're legal or illegal, just what the perspectives are on both sides.
Right. I didn't go into that because I'm dealing with the reality. They are there, whether they're legal or illegal. I'll just tell you, students in my class know this. Most experts on international law declare them illegal. The Israeli government, after the June War in 1967, asked one of their own legal authorities on international law, a man by the name of Theodore Meron, who has been in the International Court of Justice, for his opinion on the legality of Israel moving civilians from the Green Line over across into the West Bank. You can look at this document now. It's been released from Israel's archives. His opinion as an Israeli legal scholar, expert in international law, back in '67 was that such settlements would be illegal according to international law. But in some ways it's a moot point because they're there. We can argue the legality of it. They exist, and they have created a political reality. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, so while Troy gets us set up for our discussion period, thank you for already giving Professor Brann a nice round of applause for an exceptionally informational, informative, and persuasive presentation. I loved it. So at this point, we're going to have our debate and discussion session. How it's set up is on one side, we will have a can the two states reach the two populations reach a two-state solution, and the opposite, they cannot reach a two-state solution, as Professor Brann argued during his presentation. What I'll do is try to paraphrase your argument or your point as best as I can, but if I misrepresent it or my small symbolism is not correct in some way, let me know and I can fix it for you. Okay? So let's begin the discussion with anybody who would like to start. No, I will write them.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so just speak from your seats.
Okay, so yeah, so like I agree with a lot of what you said, and right now like it seems pretty impossible to have a two-state solution with settlements and with the general animosity between Israelis and Palestinians. But like I'm not willing to accept the fact that like that these two nations are going to be at war in perpetuity. Like people are dying every day on both sides. I think. I'm just not willing to accept this fact, and I think that we need change on both sides. I'll start off with the Israeli side. I think we need a little bit more of a moderate leader. Right now, Bibi Netanyahu, right now he wants to develop in the E1 territory in between the East Jerusalem and Ma'ale Adumim, and if you do that, then you basically end it. There's basically no chance.
I'll put up that slide.
Okay, yeah. If you were to develop in the E1, then basically you divide the Palestinian state, the future Palestinian state in two, and that makes it extremely complicated, so he can't do that, and obviously settlements are a problem. I totally disagree with that. I think we need to get out of there. And I would like to highlight the fact that Israel has been willing to make serious concessions for a while, and all of the security measures that he's talked about, they're not in response to just some arbitrary belief that we need to construct this wall. And we built the security wall because of the Intifada when there were suicide bombings going on. It was all in response. And when you pulled out of the Gaza Strip in 2005, it was quite an unpopular opinion. You had Israeli soldiers going to houses in the Gaza Strip, taking them out, and we were able to do that. And obviously, the outcome was not good. Hamas has taken over that territory, and there's rocket fire going into Israel. But I just want to highlight the fact that Israelis are willing to make concessions. But right now it seems as though we're becoming less and less. We don't want to make as many concessions because of the security situation. I think that's a really important consideration. So like I said, we need a more moderate Israeli government, but I also think we need a much more moderate Palestinian government. Right now you have Mahmoud Abbas, who's basically just acting in order to keep his in order to keep his power within Fatah. He really doesn't care about the Palestinian people. If he did care about them, he wouldn't tell them to go out in the streets and murder innocent Israelis. He would tell them to, be peaceful. Right now, like literally the other day, I think, in the state-controlled newspaper, I think he published like a comic that basically had Bibi Netanyahu like aiming down the scope of a sniper rifle in Paris. Like he's trying to incite his people to hate Jews. I mean, this is just ridiculous what's going on. Like we can't have Mahmoud Abbas in power, right? And if you actually look at polling in the West Bank, I think the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, they did a survey in 2014. They found that actually like a slim majority of Palestinians, they're not in support of violence. But the reason they do that is because they're influenced by their government in order to carry out that violence. And they also found that I think about a quarter of Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, they don't want a two-state solution. And I think 2/3 of those who say that if they were to accept the two-state plan, 2/3 of the people who say like, if they were to accept the two-state plan, they would do that with the intention of gaining back all of historic Palestine. And I think the Palestinians, they need a leader who's willing to stand up for the Palestinian people, and Israel also needs a leader who's willing to tell his people, like, listen, we're not going to get all of Israel. There's no way Israelis will be able to live in all greater Israel. There's no way we can secure a Jewish majority and have a democracy and also get all the land. We're going to have to give up some land. That's the reality. The ultra-religious groups are going to have to accept that, and I think the Palestinians are also going to have to accept the fact that, listen, you're going to have to settle for a two-state solution. Both sides are going to have to settle for that. And obviously, right now, I mean,
Let's let some other people talk. Don't throw it all out on the table right away. Let's try to have some discussion. You made a lot of good points. You're obviously very passionate about that. I appreciate that. But let's hear from some other people as well. Yes.
I would like to point out that I think no solution is possible for peace if Israel is a decision maker alone. What the failure of negotiation proves that Israel never wanted to give up anything and is set to take everything for itself. And that's evidence in the actions. Just leave the words out, just look at the action. That's what's happening. So Professor made the point that that the two-state solution is not possible because Israelis will not allow that. Israelis won't allow anything. So the only way to actually affect the peace solution is to put the pressure from outside. And that has to be a clear realization that you cannot leave that process to the two people. That the pressure has to come from the outside, from the world, in the name of universal values, which I think everybody here agrees that there is a problem. That there is one people who have supremacy and one people that don't. And so I would argue the professor that if Israel doesn't have 100% role as a decision maker, things can happen. After World War II, 10 million Germans had to leave their homes that they had for 1,000 years because the political powers made a decision that that land wasn't theirs and they were punished for acts of violence against the world. 10 million Germans. We have only 600,000 Israeli settlers in West Bank. And so my suggestion is that it can happen if the world will push for it. And the settlements can serve as reparations for the Palestinians who spent the last 7 decades in refugee camps.
Thank you. Who else? Yeah.
I think that, I still have those percentages stuck in my head. I've never seen it portrayed that way, so thank you. If 22.5% of the land cannot be given to the Palestinian people in a way that they would want in order to go for a two-state solution, I'm wondering if we can give them plenty of those. The solution would be that they would have less than 22.5% plus extensive monetary reparations and compensation for things such as the groundwater, agricultural land that has been taken and destroyed, or just taken. So less than the land, slightly less than the land that the Palestinian leader today would agree to, but with significant monetary compensation to make up for what they didn't get.
Okay.
Can you want to speak up because you're on the silence or?
Yeah, please speak up. Thank you. Who else we have? Else on that? Doug?
I think the biggest arguments Professor Brann made against two-state solution being possible is the mass Palestinians living in the state of Israel, and lots of Israelis living in the West Bank. So peoples are mixed together. It's hard to have one government control two people. And then as well, you spoke about the wall going to the east of the Green Line. That's another factor that's broken continuity in states. But they're melded together, which makes a clear distinction between the two states very difficult.
Who else we got? Anybody? Yeah.
Okay, so I agree with a lot of what the professor said, and I think the reality is that the land's very diverse right now in the status quo, so whatever solution has to occur has to be able to incorporate for the Palestinians living in Israel and the Israelis living in Palestine. So I do think something along the lines of a one-state solution would be ideal, like what we have in America with a lot of cultural diffusion, a lot of different ethnic groups. I think that would be ideal if we could lower racism in the country itself, like reduce these tensions between the two people. I think both nations do have a claim to the land, especially Jerusalem, and the only way there could actually be peace, I think, would be coexistence. I think something like along the lines of what Lebanon has, where the government is split between the Christians and the Muslims living in Lebanon, where there's assigned a head of state for both, would be ideal. But I think the problem right now is Israel does have a lot of political capital.
Yeah, so it'd be something extraneous to these two solutions, can or cannot. Perhaps just living more in harmony within the already defined state borders. Having more integration within the two communities is what you're arguing?
Right, correct.
Who else we got? Go back to you.
Okay. Yeah, so a lot of people like to talk about how Jerusalem, Israelis like to talk about how Jerusalem is the undivided capital of Israel, the Jewish world, whatever. But actually, if you go to Jerusalem right now, like the Palestinians who live in East Jerusalem and the Jews who live in West Jerusalem, there's very little intermingling going on. With the exception of the Jewish settlers who go to East Jerusalem just for the sake of disrupting peace, so Israel will never give up Jerusalem. But for the most part, you'll rarely have a Palestinian in East Jerusalem go to West Jerusalem because it's dangerous for them, it's attacks against them. And the same thing goes for Jews who go to East Jerusalem. So I think it's definitely possible to split up Jerusalem. And I feel like but there would need to be some way to ensure that both that Christians, Muslims, and Jews are all able to visit all the historical sites.
So kind of like an East-West Berlin sort of?
I mean, I don't really know exactly. I think maybe there would be, they would both govern the old city. I don't really know exactly what would happen, but I feel like we could definitely split up Jerusalem. That's a realistic prospect.
So starting with Jerusalem.
And another thing, I think what's really important for people on both sides is just to like live their lives without the fear of like dying and just to like have a job and stuff like that. And honestly, like I truly believe that like if Israelis were to know with like 100% certainty that if they were to pull out of the West Bank tomorrow and if they were to completely give the Palestinians 100% autonomy, there would be no violence or aggression towards them. I would 100% believe that like leaders would be willing to make significant concessions. And the only reason that we have a right wing that Likud is so powerful in Israel right now, and how Bibi has taken power is because of the security situation and the need to enforce hardline tactics in order to protect Israeli lives.
Thank you.
I actually want to thank you for that because I was also going to talk about Jerusalem in a slightly different way. I do believe that we should start with Jerusalem in terms of, I guess, testing the waters. Because it is, I think, an extremely amazing city in the sense that it is shared by the three major faiths of the world. And I think that is, that we don't need to necessarily segregate Jerusalem further. I think that that lends itself to implying that we're trying to separate the populations, that they need to somehow be kept separate, and that they're, I think, by putting up more walls and barriers, whether they be physical or mental, that lends itself to the situation and kind of sends the message that there cannot be cooperation. But I believe that if specific policies were implemented within Jerusalem to allow the three major faiths to live in harmony, for all three to have rights to the religious land, that would set a precedent throughout the entire state. And whether that led to a binational state or whether that led to a two-state solution, I think that would be the place to start, since it is arguably one of the most contested areas because it does hold such valuable meaning for so many people.
So more love for the Jerusalem solution. Who else do we have?
So the professor refrained from using words as fair and this kind of thing, but I do not believe that. I don't believe like universal values should be violated like that when you have something that is clearly against international law. Like why? I understand that the reality is that people have resettled there, but I feel like every time we give more concessions to something that is illegal, like according to international law, then who says that this can't happen again and again, even in different locations, who knows? So from an Arab perspective, I think one of the main points is that maybe they would agree to like an unconventional solution, but it definitely has to have elements of getting back part of their land, like he was saying, getting back part of the land that was like literally stolen or like claimed by someone, even in recent years, in the last few years, not even 50 years ago. So the word fair has to be applied here because they need to feel like, okay, we don't just have our rights stripped away and then we start working from here. We have to go back.
You made up my argument. This was my argument.
Definitely.
That under this reality, there's no margin to create two states for two peoples.
Definitely, but I would like to add that at least for the settlements point, this is something that Palestinians will probably not compromise for.
Thank you.
Just to respond to what he was saying, he pointed out that if Israel had a guarantee of security, then the Israelis would pull out of the West Bank. Netanyahu has made it clear that he is willing to accept a Palestinian state if it is demilitarized, and I think all of Israel will agree to a demilitarized Palestinian state. And the question is, will the Palestinians want a demilitarized state, and is that a just solution?
Okay, so there's two sides to that argument. We have to see if that is a possibility within the Israeli government or if Palestine would then agree to this.
I actually sort of have a different opinion.
Can you speak up a little?
I actually sort of have a different opinion. I think that Israel and Palestine are in a state where they just have so much enmity toward each other that it's going to be hard for them to even want to cooperate with each other unless it's like a necessity, where like one state is like so like worn out or like losing so much that like they like have to actually like concede in order to like survive as a whole. Because at the point where we're at now, like there's been so much damage onto each side that like each side's like I'm not gonna like
Right, basically two very strong traditions that don't want to concede pretty much anything. So I think that really lends itself to not being able to make this happen. In the back?
Yeah, I think it's impossible. It's important to note too that no major strides have been really reached towards a two-state solution since the assassination of Prime Minister in 1995. And I think that the political status quo today, especially with the current Prime Minister who was an advocate for constructing in settlements, pre-existing settlements in the early 2000s, I think it's important to see that in order for him to win re-election, he had to move to a point where he said that there would be no two-state solution.
Yeah.
And that was one of the reasons why the Republican Party was able to stay in power earlier this year. So I think the political status quo makes it impossible for a solution.
Politics. Politicians want to get reelected. Amanda?
I would have to agree with Professor Brann that two-state solution is not possible, but because of the regional instability, you have Israel is surrounded by so many state actors that are influencing the situation so much, be it through forms of state terrorism, the instability that's going on in civil wars in Syria, that because of that instability, it won't guarantee any form of stability in the region.
Okay, so the region. Who else do we have? Anybody else? We have about 2 more minutes of debate here. Sigrid?
I'm from Israel, and I have to say I feel like you don't don't really know the reality in Israel. And most of Israelis don't hate Arabs. We're just afraid for our life. Sometimes when we go for a bus or we see someone that looks suspicious, we're actually afraid that he might hurt us. It's something that happens every day right now in the current situation. And when we left Gaza Strip, they had everything they could to build life, and they just destroy everything. And now there is a war between Hamas and some people from ISIS over there. And this is exactly what's going to happen in Gaza Strip, in the West Bank. They will build a state over there. They can't now, and they don't have the security measurements to maintain the state right now. They just can't do it. And they also they teach their children from they are like 3. You can watch Palestinian TV. They just teach them to hate Jews. You can see 4 years old people, children, on TV say they want to kill Jews, and they have children shows on TV. They tell them how to kill Jews, how to do it. They just hate us. They don't want to stay. They just want to expel all the Jews from Israel and build their state. And I believe that if they will have state, then the terror will just be worse, and we can't live in peace if this will happen. So this is why Israelis are against the Palestinian state. And we don't hate Arabs that want to live in peace with us. I study in Technion, and we have about a third of the students are Arabs, and we live in peace with them, and we're friends with them, and we do homework with them and everything. We don't hate them, nothing like that. We're just afraid for our life from Islamist extremists that live in the West Bank in the Gaza Strip.
Okay. So I'm gonna pretty much everybody has your hands up. Keep your hands up, please. But everyone, that's the last people that are gonna get to talk because we don't have too much time. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So listen.
Okay, just to respond to that, like, when I was little, I lived in Palestine, and I mean, the TV wasn't good. Like, I had to watch Cinderella in Arabic and stuff, but there's nothing about killing Israelis, okay? I promise you, like,
Can I open now and show you things? You can just open YouTube and put this in search and you can find
Please
it.
let them finish.
Okay, well, the vast majority of Palestinians want peace. I'm sure and the vast majority of Israelis want peace, okay? But I think the big problem here is there's so much tension built up between both sides that we misrepresent each other. We think, oh, they want to kill us, they want, the Palestinians are barbaric, the Israelis are barbaric. And I think the first step to getting peace is to get rid of these misconceptions, to stop thinking of the other side as evil and just see them as people who just want to be treated with respect on both sides.
That's a large socialization process that would take quite a long time, but that's what we're working towards. That's why we're here. I think you were next.
Yes. I actually completely agree with that. I believe that there is a legitimate security concern on both sides. I completely recognize that, and I do believe that there is. I think the main problem here, honestly, is fear. And I know that we can't really combat fear with a political institution, but really and truly, I believe that if we begin the process of normalization, the professor himself said that like Jews and Arabs and Christians lived in peace for the longest time, and I truly believe that if we began a process of normalization in the States and stopped media propaganda, media portrayal on both sides as of the other state and the other side as enemies and as hateful and as barbaric, that we could begin a process of normalization. I mean, here within America, we have Jewish students within our university, Muslim students, Christian students that live in peace. And I don't see at all why that can't be the same way in Israel. And I would like to also add on that I do believe that there is a human rights aspect to this debate that should be acknowledged, in the sense that while both security concerns are very legitimate, I do believe that a lot of the hatred and security concerns on the Israeli side come from the Palestinian anger and opposition to the occupation and the systems with which they must comply to within the Israeli government, and the fact that they are not granted the same rights as Israeli citizens. And I think that once that human rights issue is tackled, and then the process of normalization can begin, and hopefully everyone can live in peace.
Yeah, I think you guys are next. Or you go? Whichever one wants to go first.
Just go in geographic order.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, building on what was said, misconceptions and fear were two words that were used, and I think that's very true. The woman from Israel was talking about propaganda on Palestinian TV that she has seen about, anti-Jewish, anti-Israeli sentiment, and I think while that very well may exist, and I believe that you've seen it, Fox News is on TV in this country. It does not represent my opinion. Hamas and Fatah don't represent the opinions of all Palestinians, just as Bibi does not represent the opinions of all Jews in Israel. And I think it's very important to realize that leadership does not represent people in their entirety. I also want to go back to if it can or it can't happen. One thing for the can, so the professor said that it would be pretty unforeseeable to move huge amounts of people across a newly formed border, and move all the Arab Israelis into Palestine and all the Jewish settlers out of the West Bank. While it's unfeasible, it has been done historically, not without bloodshed. And I would hope that I'm thinking of Pakistan and India, one of the largest migrations in human history. Millions moved, millions dead.
That's how Israel was created in the first place.
Yeah, but I think if that was done post-colonialism in a really shitty time, and this is a much smaller group of people, and I think it has a much better infrastructure, at least on the Israeli side. And if that were an option that were agreed upon by the communities to actually help people, I think it could be done in a much less bloody way than Pakistan and India.
So some sort of
Some mass migration done in a peaceful way and agreed upon by multiple communities.
in the back.
And I would like to follow on your footsteps, saying that really it is possible to migrate people from the West Bank to outside of West Bank. Settlements cannot function on their own in any way without the military support, without the financial support, and without the subsidies. So these people are there only because they were offered very advantageous terms to live there. And the moment you take those privileges away, they are not sustainable. So there is a very good way to go about this. But that doesn't mean that I actually advocate for the two-state solution. I personally advocate for one-state solution to return Palestine to what it used to be, a land for all people. But I wanted to respond to what you said, the young girl from Israel. I don't know if you are aware that recently Paret reported on a recent study of racism among the young population. Young Israelis are extremely racist, according to those Jewish scholars, proud of it and ready to act on their violence. So this is a systematic change, and what people need to realize that normally you have young generations in any society that are progressive, that are open, that are more humanistic. This is a reverse in Israel, when the youngest generation is the most racist from them all. So we have to remember about it, and that's why I wanted to emphasize the fact that for any solution, whichever you advertise, whichever you support, two-state, one-state, or the combination of the two, the pressure will have to come from the outside, because the Israeli society, majority of it is unable to go through any process, peace process. So that's why I'm saying BDS.
Okay, thank you. Last one.
I think when you talk about international pressure, I think a big factor in the resolution of this conflict will be, or it has been at least, and has failed so far, is America. And I think there's not sufficient pressure coming from America. I think there's something maybe inherent in American political culture, or part of the system where America tends to support Israel's claims more than they do the Palestinian. And I think without an America pushing firmly for change in the region, I think that it will be very difficult for any resolution.
Okay. That's all the time we have for debate right now. Troy has already passed out all of the slips, so your options are to vote that you believe that we're going to affirm Professor Brann's can't reach a conventional two-state solution based on what we've talked about on the board. If you have any questions, want to come look at the ones that I've put down, you're more than welcome to do that. Or you can write can on the paper to go against and refute what he said. Your third option is also to abstain from voting. You don't need to vote.
So do you want can or can't?
Can or can't, just one word. And then Fernando and maybe Hassan can help me.
Just hold them up when you're done by voting.
Jackson, help me.
Hey everybody, just a quick couple of announcements while the votes are being tallied, while they're being collected. I think this is a really good exercise that we all just did. I mean, people presented a lot of good points. We had a great discussion going with people on both sides speaking their minds, so this is exactly how it's supposed to go. I applaud everyone for keeping it respectful, keeping it civil, and not getting too heated in their arguments, even though this is a pretty contentious topic. So I just want to announce that we do have another debate yet this semester on December 1st. We're going to have Professor Andrew Little, and he's going to address the question, does your vote matter in this country? So he's actually going to take the stance that your vote doesn't matter, that there's no point in going to the polls. So it should be an interesting argument. People on both sides talking about whether or not we actually have a functioning democracy. And so next semester we're going to be shooting to have, that's the last debate for this semester, we're going to be having debates every week next semester. We've already got 3 speakers lined up for next semester. We'll fill out the entire calendar. We'll have 12 or 13 of these next semester. So we've got lots to look forward to. And a final announcement while votes are being tallied. A few weeks ago, we passed a resolution saying that the U.S. should do more about poverty. So in the spirit of that resolution, we're organizing a group of volunteers to go help out at the Groves and Fishes Community Food Center in Florida. So we're looking for volunteers to help us on Monday, November 30th, to help go down and pass out food to people in need. So if you'd like to volunteer with that, we've got 6 or 7 slots. Just come up and talk to me. You can sign up with my computer after that. So December 1st, we have our next speaker. Make sure to like us on Facebook or visit our website. You can see a schedule of all our activities. Okay, so
We have come to a solution, a resolution, by a vote of a resolution, not a solution, that is the opposite of a solution. We agree with Professor Brann by a vote of 27-18 with 4 abstentions that the Arab and Israeli conflict cannot be resolved through a two-state solution.